Thank you, Jamie. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. We will share with you a case study about how one organization used their behavior framework to drive sales performance in their organization. But before we get to the actual case study, I wanted to share a simple but powerful fact with you about the relationship between behavior and results. Typically, when you are trying to meet performance targets, what we find is those meeting of performance targets often hinges on whether people consistently demonstrate those behaviors that are business critical. And when I say business critical, I mean those behaviors that have the most direct linkage to results. What that means is not all behaviors are created equal in terms of the value they have in driving results. So when you are trying to change the results you're currently getting, if you need different or new results, the first thing you need to do is to understand what are those business critical behaviors that are most likely to give you the lift you need, and why are they not occurring at the rates that you need them to, and how can the environment support those new or different behaviors to get the performance you need. And the client example we're about to share with you talks about how this organization used exactly this framework and this lens to approach a performance challenge they had. Let me tell you a little bit more about the context for this case study. The client we're talking about is an organization that puts up sales teams, national sales teams, to go and support large pharmaceutical organizations in the sales of their drugs. We were asked to join a project that was focused on one national team, and this particular team had been in place for several months at this point, but there were a couple of things that were maybe not unique for a sales team, but they certainly were starting to pop up as potential barriers to performance. So first of all, this particular group of sales reps and regional directors had extensive experience in different areas of sales. And so they came with different histories of what types of drugs they had sold, where they had sold them. And that also meant they had very different tools and frameworks and best practices they used when out in the field or when coaching sales reps. When we were brought into this particular situation, there was a realization that in the following months, there would likely be a drop in scripts being written by healthcare providers for this particular drug. And the intention was to figure out a way to prevent this particular drop-off. At the same time, there was a realization that there were really not enough touch points between the sales reps and their direct managers that could be used as a way to address the situation proactively. So the main objectives of us being brought into this project were to, number one, increase the sales effectiveness and the overall sales results for this national team, and using a behavioral framework to do so. And secondly, develop a more standardized regional director leadership and coaching approach where people were using specific tools and frameworks more consistently. So how did we go about this particular project? First, I should say that this was a unique project in the sense that it was only 3 months long. We had about 3 weeks to get started with the initial analysis and preparation for launch, and 9 weeks to roll out the actual project itself and impact behavior change and drive results. We started with a gap analysis, which is a very typical way to start a project. As you see in the center bottom of the screen, we had a leadership offsite during which we reviewed the results of the gap analysis, decided on the quick wins that would help close some gaps immediately, and then created what we call an alignment matrix, which is a map that shows what are the actual business critical behaviors that the sales reps need to perform at different rates or quality or frequency. What are the manager behaviors that support the sales rep behaviors, and how is leadership in general going to support the sales reps and create an environment for everyone to demonstrate those behaviors and drive results? We also used a technology-based messaging system to increase the number of touch points that we have between the regional directors and the sales reps, and just increase the overall communication frequency and touch points. And that allowed us to create feedback loops that were much more rapid than they would typically occur in this particular setting. As you may know, sales reps work on their own for most of the time, and the regional directors do their coaching field rides, but those field rides are far and few in between because every regional director has a large number of sales reps reporting into them. So the goal was using technology as a way to increase the number of touch points that were given to the sales reps. And finally, we had a behavioral dashboard. This behavioral dashboard was a means for us to capture all of the data we were collecting on the actual behaviors, and then have some structured discussions at the weekly regional team meetings, as well as the national team discussions, leadership discussions, about how to further strengthen the behaviors and get better results. Let's talk a bit more about the gap analysis, how that was done. For the gap analysis, we used Alula's DCOM model for high-performing organizations. The DCOM model is 4 categories, starting with direction. In the direction category, we try to answer the question, does everyone know what they need to do and why they need to do it? In the competence category, we try to answer the question, can everyone do what you ask them to do, or is there a need to further develop knowledge and skills? In the opportunity category, we want to know whether there are the right resources and tools and authorities to do the work. And finally, in the motivation category, we look at whether people are actually getting reinforced for doing the right thing, for doing what they've been asked to do. When you look at direction, competence, and opportunity categories, what you'll find is if there are elements missing in those categories, people have a hard time performing even if they want to. At the same time, if the motivation is not there, if the reinforcement isn't there for the right behaviors, you might run into resistance and variable or low performance. So let's look at some of the outcomes of that gap analysis. And this is just an excerpt, but just to give you a feeling for the kinds of things we addressed. For example, there was some difficulty in the communication and some lack of alignment initially between the client, so the pharmaceutical organization, and the sales leadership of our client. And so there needed to be some improvements around expectations and communication there. Also, the dashboards that contained all the key data were way too complex. And that meant sometimes some of the managers or regional directors were not clear on which metrics to focus on when. That in turn meant that the sales reps were not clear how to interpret and leverage the data, or they focused on the data that they were most comfortable with, but potentially missed out on valuable information because they were not looking at other data. Managers were coaching towards several different behaviors, so there was no consistency, and managers tended to coach towards the things that they thought were critical, but that did not always mean that those were actually the business critical behaviors that drove results. We noticed that there was some skill building needed around pre-call planning, and when the sales reps were asked about their specific needs, they said, we're very motivated, very engaged, but we need clearer direction, more communication, and more feedback from our managers. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key components was figuring out what the quick wins were. And for instance, a quick win might be that we looked at the dashboards and we started to filter the dashboards to make sure that the right data was sent to the right people. And we also developed some instructions for how to interpret the data. At the same time, another example of the quick win was that we reintroduced some of the pre-call planning tools and training that was already in place, but that some people had not seen or participated in a while. There were other things that came out of these findings that required different kind of planning, like the sales reps needing more direction, communication, and feedback, which is where, for example, the technology came in that we mentioned earlier. So let's look at the alignment map that I mentioned earlier. If you remember, the alignment map or matrix is how we know what people need to do to drive results. And typically in a sales organization, there are lots of leading and lagging results that are being tracked and communicated all the time. Now, there is sometimes a bit of a challenge in the fact that those results data can be delayed. So acting on those results, there's always going to be a delay in the impact that you see. But the main question for the alignment matrix was, given the results that we're trying to see, in this case, for example, making sure that the number of scripts that were being written was actually stable or increasing compared to the baseline and not decreasing, what did the sales reps need to do differently? What were the critical few things that would have the most impact on those outcomes? And in this case, one of the examples might be in some of the regions, the sales reps had a difficult time asking discovery questions of a healthcare provider that would allow them to then take that information and reframe how they sold the drug in a way that added value to this particular HCP. So not everyone was comfortable with the discovery question process. That might be an example of a sales rep behavior. And then we looked at, in order for that to happen, what do the managers need to do on an ongoing basis to support that? And what does leadership in general need to do to support that? And you might say, well, how do I know what that might look like? Well, that's when we look at behavior through a slightly different lens. So I just mentioned, you see behavior in the center of the screen. Yes, let's use the behavior of asking discovery questions by the sales reps as an example. In order for a sales rep to use those questions, there has to be some kind of information, some kind of trigger or prompt, something that tells that person I should be using discovery questions. We call those things antecedents. And some examples of antecedents are things like maybe this person received training on sample discovery questions, or maybe there was a best practice sharing with other sales reps and they shared how they used the discovery questions to get HCP buy-in. Or maybe there was direction from the regional director as they were out on a coaching field ride that said, I want to observe your discovery questions today. Or maybe the regional director role-played the discovery questions before going into a sales conversation. Now, on the other side of the equation, you have the consequences. Every sales rep behavior has a consequence. There are many different types of consequences, and you see a couple of examples on the screen. And you can imagine if you're an experienced sales rep that is comfortable with discovery questions and then taking that information and using that to frame their sales pitch or their next conversation topics, they might feel that doing that in and of itself is a satisfying, encouraging process. They might know from experience that if they do this well, then their probability of getting a better compensation is greater. And there are many reasons why this person may engage in this process. But I said earlier, there were sales reps that were not comfortable with the discovery questions. And in that instance, there were more discouraging consequences for those individuals. And most of them had to do with a great feeling of discomfort in trying to figure out what is the right discovery question, and am I really helping the HCP? Because some of those sales reps came out of environments where the sales process was geared more towards a structured selling of the benefits of the product rather than an interactive conversation with the HCP. So what does that mean for our manager behaviors? It means that if we want to now define what the manager needs to do, we ask the question, for this sales rep, what are they experiencing in terms of antecedents and what are they experiencing in terms of consequences? And then the manager can decide what they need to change or add to either side to strengthen the behavior. So for example, a manager might introduce more consistent role playing before going into a client interaction, or they may spend more time on providing pinpointed feedback right after the interaction to improve the behavior. Now, what did we do to actually move the behaviors and the results forward? Well, we created behavioral dashboards. What you see on the screen is not really a full dashboard. It's just an example of the types of things that might be on a dashboard. But the point is this: you can't just provide what I just called an antecedent and expect people to do the right thing. So we couldn't just say to people, here are the behaviors. We've done this alignment map, and now we know what you should be doing and where you should be focusing more than usual, and walk away. Instead, we found ways to track the actual behaviors for each sales rep and each regional director. Now, keep in mind, this is a virtual team. The team actually never met in the same place while we conducted this project. So we had data that were collected from data entered into a system internally. We had self-reported data. We had observational data. We had all kinds of data that was added up over time. Typically twice a week, we collected these data points. And what we really wanted to see was if the sales regional director, if they changed their behavior, which, as we said earlier, is geared perfectly towards driving and supporting the sales rep behavior, we should see a change in behavioral trends, a positive change in the sales rep behavior. And if we truly pick the critical, business-critical behaviors, you should then see a change in leading and lagging results. And the behavioral dashboards were reviewed weekly in regional and national team meetings. And there were a set of guided questions and talking points that came with each of these dashboards that were then discussed in a group, and proactive planning was done to overcome any barriers and try to increase performance even further. So what was the impact of what we did? First of all, we realigned the sales force on critical behaviors and results to be worked on. We had much more focused field coaching conversations now. We also had improved communication across the regions and sales reps, including regular exchange of best practices among those reps. So we used this technology as a way to allow sales reps from different regions to share their best practices and observations and give each other feedback. We allowed for generally faster feedback loops on behaviors and essentially performance, because every week the sales reps learned about how they were doing on those critical behaviors. And finally, we had much improved weekly sales team meetings because there was a very focused structure around those behavior results conversations, in addition to, of course, the other topics that would typically go into a sales team meeting. But most importantly, what we were able to achieve is, first of all, we met the objective of increasing sales rep behavior consistently whenever the regional directors, whenever the sales leaders were engaged. And we avoided that anticipated performance dip. that we were brought in to prevent. What's important to note here is that we actually had a region where the regional director turned over halfway through the project. And what was interesting to see, since we were tracking behavior and results consistently throughout the project, is that this particular region, the behaviors of the sales reps stagnated or decreased, and the performance was also worse than in other regions as soon as the regional director left. However, when the new regional director came in and he right away started working on his leadership practices to support the sales reps behavior started to change and the results changed as well. So we had almost a control group in the mix. And again, this is what happened within a 3-month time period with a team that was never in the same place at the same time, by looking at what are the business critical behaviors, how do we need to strengthen and support them, how do we need to remove barriers, and this is how we ended up with such a positive outcome in the end. And with that, we're at the end of our case study. Thank you very much for listening to this example.